It's great to have you back in my studio for our advanced programs. Now that we've survived our first 7 lessons together during the introductory course, I think it's time to explore a lot of those topics in depth now and just get into some more details, some more exciting bits. One of our favourite things to do with liquid radiance and colours and techniques is playing with salt, because there are so many facets to it, and we gave it just a tiny little quick peek when we were looking at the basic sessions on our first introductory lesson, number 1. What I want to do with you today is take a broader look at what salts can do. Basically, we're looking at things that are in the pantry, we're looking at things that dissolve. And different size salts are going to make different markings in your fabric. So here I have rock salt. Look, it does say sea crystals, but that's okay. It's rock salt. It's the big stuff. I've got cooking salt, a finer crystal. I've got one of my favourite, not from the pantry, probably from the shed, but pool salt. And this can be absolutely amazing because sometimes it has really random size crystals. Sometimes they're quite regular. You never know what you're getting with a bag of pool salt, but it's always exciting and way more economical than your cooking type salts. Yes, you can use table salt as well. It's just really, really fine. And the size of the salt is going to determine the size of the markings that you make in your fabrics. We all know that our salt shakers clog up in wet weather. So any of these sodium chloride type salts are going to keep pulling in moisture from the atmosphere when you're working with them on a wet day. Will liquid radiance work on a wet day? Absolutely yes. Would I have worked with dyes on a wet day when I was working with dyes way back then? Absolutely no, because I would know that they were just not going to give me a good result. I do have, though, here what I call my goof-proof salt, and that is Epsom salts. And it doesn't pull in moisture from the atmosphere like your sodium chloride salts do. I actually like to buy my Epsom salts from the health food shops because they come in this packet with a clear panel in it and you can actually see what you're buying. Whereas when you buy it from the supermarket, it's usually in a cardboard box and you can't see what's inside. So yeah, you can actually get an idea of the size of the crystals when you buy from the health food shops. Okay, so I hope those few little clues help you with choosing your salts for your projects. What we're going to do now, though, involves salt mountains. What we've discovered is that by putting great big high hills of salt, well, not too big, across your coloured fabrics while the fabrics are still wet, the salt does amazing things towards pulling the colour to it and then leaving gaps. So I'm going to take you through all that. One sad thing about Epsom salts for this is I've never had a good one work yet. So if you want to avoid Epsom for this particular technique, let's put that one aside. Okay, so when we look at the pieces of fabric here, this one has very big markings on it, and that would have been rock salt. This one has very fine markings on it, and you see what I'm talking about here is the markings that are actually the bottoms of the mountains. So the size of the salt will determine the size of the markings at the bottoms of the mountains. I'm going to just be applying my colours with a 5-finger foam brush in a moment, but before we get to that, let's think of other ways of applying the colours. When we did our silk painting lessons in the introductory course, we were looking at palette mop-ups and using the leftover colours in the palette to put a piece of fabric in and then colour it. That is just an amazing way of getting stripes in your fabric anyway. So you could actually, on a small piece of fabric, use the palette mop-up technique. But hey, look what I've got here. This came to me in a Secret Santa several years ago, and it just happened to be that one of my friends who contributed that was watching me when I opened the parcel, and my face just glowed because, yeah, I knew what I was going to do with it. And she looked at me and said, "Yeah, I'm glad you got that. I know what you're going to do with it." So great minds think alike. Thanks, Fran. Okay, when you're wanting to do big pieces of fabric, something like this is absolutely ideal because you can put your colours in there and get quite a large piece of fabric done, not just a little sample where your ordinary palette is just perfect for those. Or if you don't have a Secret Santa and a friend who's contributed something like this, just a series of little bowls with your colours in them, maybe takeaway food containers, spaced apart, and you can do quite large pieces of fabric with very little effort at all. So just another one of our many colouring methods that we'll meet along the way. Okay, let's get to work. I have actually pre-wet some fabric here, and I'm keeping it damp by having it under another board. You are familiar with my plastic covered boards. It's not sloppy wet and it's not too dry either. I am going to need some mop-up fabric, and I'm actually going to use this piece damp. So let's go through the wetting process anyway. As a reminder, dunk your fabric in water, squeeze till no more drips come out. And if you're losing your squeeze, if your fingers are getting a bit arthritic, it is okay to blot in a towel, but I'm not going to do that because my fingers aren't arthritic. My knees and my feet are, but never mind. Right, so that's ready for when I'm ready for it. Colouring this fabric, I'm going to use the familiar 5-finger foam brush. Okay, I have some teal made up here. And I'm just going to draw colours on. This teal is a mixture of our blue and green. Remember that excess is your enemy. Whatever you are doing with Liquid Radiance colours, the rules apply. Excess is the enemy. While there's moisture, there's movement. If I put too much colour in the fabric, the excess will stay there and make my fabric stiff and dull. No, we don't want that. So there's our green going on. That's one of our straight colours. They're only, reminder, only 9 in the range. But all pure pigment, so you can mix anything you want from those basic 9. By leaving the gaps in there, it means the colours have room to move, and that is really important with this technique. Here's some lime going in. This is yellow with a little bit of green in it. Also thinking about the size of the gaps as I work this. If my gaps are any bigger than about 1 centimetre, remember my little centimetre measure from past workshops, little finger. Yeah, they come in slightly different sizes, but that's okay. Saves you getting out a ruler. Saves a lot of mucking around. Oops, that one wants to be green. Now, I've used colours that are side by side on the colour circle, the analogous colours, so I know they're going to blend beautifully. I could do the good 5-finger foam brush. I could have used a real foam brush, but then I would have had to clean them. So I'm just going to use the 5-finger foam brush, and I can be really neat and tidy if I don't want to blend my colours too much, and simply wipe off my fingers on towel or a bit of damp fabric between, but I am going to do the whole fist foam brush here. Yay, this will be quick. The aim is to get a nice even coverage of colour across the fabric, and I don't mind if those colours blend. Just something to keep in mind here. I've got samples all around me. But this process should not be messy. If you are being messy with this, you're not doing it right, guys. Could I have put on rubber gloves for this? Yeah, it seems a lot of effort, and I don't like working with rubber gloves anyway. The colours are all non-toxic, let's remind you about that. They'll wash off my skin really, really easily. Soap and water and a nail brush. But what I have on my hands is too good to waste, so I'm going to put that on another piece of fabric. Okay, with liquid radiance, we have to think excess is the enemy. If I've put too much colour into there, I'm going to have to mop it out. I've put wet colour onto wet fabric. It is likely to be a little bit sloppy. You can probably see that on my fingers. Yeah, and let's get rid of that. And this is a very different sort of a mop-up. I'm not sure if we covered it in the basics. I've got to clean up my board, of course. Can't waste all that lovely colour. And this time I'm just going to go plonk, 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 plonk with my piece of damp fabric. I'm not adding moisture, I'm just pulling out the colour. I could have laid a piece of absorbent fabric across the top and just sucked it up that way. But no, this is a little bit different. And I've got another piece of fabric that is going to go with that project. Just clean up some of those little spotty bits on there. And I wanted them blended anyway if we go back to our original thoughts. And now that is no longer sloppy, I'm ready to add the salt. Just put that one aside for the moment. Dry off my fingers. Okay, this is the fun bit, folks. Deciding which salt to use. I'm going to run with the pool salt. I can be neat and tidy, and notice that my board is significantly bigger than my piece of fabric for that. That is important. Good 3 to 4 fingers around the outside, because when you're adding the salt, I think is important to actually apply the salt so that it's onto the board as well. It just makes it look as if you've cut that piece of fabric out of a bigger bit. I know that's cheating, but hey, why not? Okay, Salt Mountains is the name of the game. What I'm going to do here is apply a mountain of salt that's about 1 to 2 fingers wide. And then I want my mountains to be 3 to 4 fingers apart. We need that distance between them for the colours to have room to move. So if we look at this, we can sort of see the spotty bits where the mountains were, and then that strong colour between where the colours have been pulled by the salt. We know that salt draws colour to it. Okay. So we can either do the neat and tidy method using a spoon, or we can go the pour it on method. Does it have to follow the stripes? No, I sort of like this, it's quicker. Okay, so my mountains are going to be about 1/2 finger high, and actually those little bits that fall off the sides of the mountains add to your design. But do we want too much between the mountains? No, because that will mess up the design. You can wander these wherever you want them, you can make symmetrical patterns, you can do whatever you want. But we're thinking about 1/2 finger high and about 1 to 2 fingers wide for your mountains. If you think you might be a bit dangerous using a pouring method like this, think about putting your salt in a jug with a pouring lid. Makes it easy. Now I like to have some salt down the edges of my piece as well. That's probably fairly big in there, so we might just put a little interesting bit up there. Let's get delicate now. Have a little salt hill in there. You can do whatever you want. Good fun. Just trying things. But remember, you need the gaps, and we don't want too much salt between the mountains, because that also will stop it from pulling where you want it to. I think that fella could go a bit longer. Now for the fun bit. Leave the blooming thing alone until it's dry. That's the hard bit. I'm sorry about that. Okie doke. Let's put that one aside. Now, I do have salty fingers. You know I'm anal about salt. Salt is brilliant stuff. Whoops, I missed a bit on the end here. Salt is brilliant stuff, but if you get it where you don't want it, it will get into mischief. It will put markings where you didn't even know you put them. I'm still going to mess around with this bit here. I just look at it and think it needs a bit more, needs something else to balance it. Leave it alone, Anne. That'll do. Yes, and we put that aside to dry. Another one of these techniques where it's really fun, watching paint dry. There are so many of them that we do. It will probably take about 24 hours to dry. Oh, it could be shorter depending on the weather. If the moisture, if it pulls in moisture from the atmosphere, by the way, I'm just going to give my fingers a quick wash here. You shouldn't wash in your water that you're using to wet your fabrics because it's creating salty water. But I want to handle other fabrics and I don't want to transfer salt onto them. See, I am anal about working with salt, and I want you to be also. So, when we look at these fabrics I have in front of me, you can see where the mountains have been and where the hills have been. Mountains, hills, valley. However you want it. Big salt, mountains, hill, mountains, hill. Oh no, that was a bit of a long line I put in there. Okay, but the valley in between. Now, depending on the fabric, the salt is so busy pulling the colour towards it that if you've got a big enough gap between them, you do get that lovely strong marking in the middle. Gaps too close, you won't get that strong marking. So I can't emphasise strongly enough the 1 to 2 fingers, 3 to 4 fingers. Everybody's got fingers, saves you thinking centimetres, makes the life very, very easy. Look what happens when you do salt hills. You get scones. Same rules apply. Couple of fingers wide, a few fingers apart. On heaps your salt, about 1/2 centimetre high, and yep, good results. These two pieces I'm showing you have actually been done with one colour colouring instead of multicolour colouring, but they've been mixed colours, so as the salt works you get that lovely breakdown of colour in the gaps where the two colours sort of come alive. So that was a browny greeny mix, sort of an olivey colour, and this one was a mixture of brown and yellow, probably russet on the colour mixing guide. On the front piece I've put the hills all lined up. On this one I've put them alternating. You can put your hills however you want and see what you too can create. So let's have a think about those mop-ups, folks. The piece that I've started with my current project doesn't have a lot of colour in it yet, but you could just lay that flat or make hills and valleys and salt that and you'd have a really interesting piece of paler fabric. So far in our sessions, in our introductories, we've looked at these weird little globs of screwed up pieces that we've popped at different angles while they're drying and then opened them up and ironed them to make amazing backgrounds for other pieces of work, for adding other details to them, or just being the light piece that goes with your other pieces in your project. But think about the fact that you can actually create something quite amazing from these screwed up pieces too, simply by laying them flat. This one was done from a greeny purpley two greeny purpley pieces of fabric and just mopped that up, and I thought, oh, that could look a bit floral if I popped some salt onto there. So that's what I did. So don't give up on these bits. Don't waste anything with your mop-ups, your things that you dry off your boards. Yes, just make sure you are not wasting anything. One of the ugliest mop-ups that I ever did was this one. In its ball, it looked horrible. But this is where you fall in love with your iron and your ironing board, and you just see all those colours that are popping up in the creases. That is actually a piece of unbleached calico. So that's quite coarse, and it doesn't form the patterns nearly as easily as a bleached calico or a homespun or whatever other fabric you're using. Every fabric will be different depending on its weave. But don't waste them. Now for the fun bit. Getting rid of the salt. Folks, this one is dry. I am not going to move it, but this will be a how-to. When your fabrics are dry, and there's a lot of salt there, it has absorbed moisture from the atmosphere, it can feel clammy. So here's a good test for it. If you can see that the salt has done its thing, and that one hasn't, okay, but you will see it. If you can touch it, always using the backs of your fingers, and it doesn't feel wet but feels clammy, it is probably okay to move that salt. So wait until it is dry or clammy. If any colour comes off onto your finger, leave it alone. If you just can't wait any longer for it to dry, after it's pretty much done its thing, it is okay to carefully blow it with a hairdryer, or you can't do this on a wet day, but put it in the sun next morning if it's sunny, and make sure the fabric is as dry as you can get it, remembering that salt is going to keep pulling moisture from the atmosphere in the wet weather. Just a funny story here. When I was doing the last project that's just been published, it's March, and Embellish, March 21, has just come. It was pouring with rain and my fabrics just stayed wet, 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 but the end results were still stunning. The beauty of working with liquid radiance. Yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do that with dyes. Anyway, yep, so I just had to make sure the fabrics were totally dry before I desalted. Desalting, here's the action. We don't want salt going everywhere. We're going to pull the salt, scrape the salt to the middle of our work of art, then simply funnel it, hold up your fabric and funnel it back into its container. If the salt is damp though, pop it on a baking tray in the oven for about 20 minutes, and that way it will dry out the salt before you return it to its container, because you don't want the salt staying wet till next time. Dry salt is definitely going to work better than damp salt. Okay, so that's the desalting done. Your next step is to get rid of the remaining saltiness out of your fabric. So you'll just pick up that fabric that now has no physical salt on it and dunk it into water. Give it a good old squish around. We know that when liquid radiance is dry, it's stable. Nothing is going to come out of it. Give it a good old squish. You've got salty water. Get a fresh dish of water. This is let's pretend. Okay. Get the salty water out. Another dish of water. And it's not great volumes of water. Make sure you've got the saltiness out. On big pieces, I can go up to about 5 rinses, and I just want to be absolutely sure that there's not going to be any salt going anywhere else in my house, or in my studio, or on my ironing board, or on my iron, and I certainly don't want salt through my sewing machine. So yes, that desalting process and the rinsing is so important. You then simply put it on your ironing board to iron it, When it's dry, half a minute for really strong colour, up to 2 minutes for really pale colour. All those rules apply. So, happy salting. Just a little PS to the desalting. I forgot. Sorry. Okay, when you're using a lot of salt in your projects, it is very possible that there will be bits of, remembering that liquid radiance is a paint, bits of the paint actually stuck at the bottom of the mountains and beyond the surface of your fabric. And it is so important that that stuck stuff, the dry salt, comes away. Okay, what you're going to do when you're soaking it is you may notice that there is a smudge of colour in the water. That is not a worry, provided your fabric was totally dry. So that's really important that your fabric was totally dry. That smudge of colour is the dry stuff that's just got to come away anyway. So the good news is, even though your water may be coloured, you can put all sorts of different coloured fabrics in there to desalt them at the same time. The colour that comes out was dry and is therefore inactive, and it will not adversely affect any other pieces of fabric that is sharing the bowls of water with them. All right, so just, really important to get that excess saltiness out of the fabric, but the surface saltiness away as well. A couple of garments that I want to show you now. One is the one I'm wearing, and one is another old favourite that's been on and off me for years and years. Once you've got liquid radiance into your fabrics, nothing is going to get rid of them. Yeah, you can see, this was a lime t-shirt, and you can see where the mountains have been and how the valleys have formed. It could be interesting for you to think about doing this technique through 2 layers, although different fabrics will form different markings. When we look at the back side of this, the markings are totally different and totally yummy. When we look at the front of the shirt I'm wearing, this was a pale mauve shirt. I can't wear pale mauve in a fit, but by adding the extra colours to it, it just zinged it up for me. Yes, you can see the mountains and the valleys. This shirt is so old that I actually had to put a couple of tucks in the ribbing so that it sat down flat instead of being like a little sitting up collar. It was really quite weird. What am I going to do? I love that shirt. Okay. Front, different from reverse. So a little challenge for you can be to try working through 2 layers of fabric and see what happens. It'll work differently on woven fabric from what it does on knit fabric, but give it a go. Or do your shirts just as I've done and see what you can achieve. Have fun.